So for this sculpture, I am going to be using Sculpey Medium. I've got a pound of it over here. And I'm going to start by just blocking in the big shapes. Blocking in is just working quickly to get the main forms onto the sculpture. So we're not worrying about details or texture yet. Just really want to get the armature / epoxy covered with clay while paying attention to anatomy. You don't just want to slap it on haphazardly. So I normally start with the torso and get that covered. And you can see I'm just pulling off small pieces of clay and pressing them onto the armature and just kind of lightly smoothing them together, not going crazy with the smoothing just yet. Okay. Sculpey should just soften with the heat of your hands. If you find that it's too soft, you may just have a very new package of Sculpey, and all that oil you feel in there is what's known as the plasticizers, and sometimes you just need to leach some of that out of the clay. If you flatten out layers of your Sculpey and sandwich them between sheets of paper, you can actually pull out some of that excess plasticizer and get the clay dried out a little bit. If you have a pasta machine, using that to roll out sheets of clay can make that a little easier. This clay right now it's been sitting in my cabinet for quite a while, and it's kind of the perfect consistency. It's not too soft and, not crumbly. Once Sculpey's been sitting around for a while, it gets dry and crumbly. If you have old clay like that, the dry and crumbly kind of clay, you can actually add oil to it using like a mineral oil or baby oil. And Sculpey actually makes a softener that you can use to kind of bring that clay back to life. So you just want to keep layering that clay on. Make sure it's tight against the epoxy. You don't want any air bubbles in there. It's not like ceramic clay where if there's an air bubble in it, it's going to explode in the oven or anything like that, but you don't want the clay shifting around on the armature. So this early on in the sculpting, I just stick to using my hands to sculpt. I really don't use any tools right at first. I have a couple tools on hand if I run into any sticky situations. But generally I like to just use my hands. It's faster and you can get a lot more done than you might think with using just your hands. You just kind of want to work out the bumps and cracks as you move along. Chances are you're going to be refining that further, so there's really no need to go crazy with the smoothing this early on. Another thing you might notice, the more you handle Sculpey, the softer it gets. So you might notice as you're working that your clay or your sculpture starts getting kind of squishy and harder to work with. When that happens, you might want to just step back from the sculpture for a little bit and let it kind of cool off a little bit, harden back up. But also get into the habit of moving around the sculpture as you work, so you're not working on one certain area for too long. Like I'm working on the neck now, and as it starts to get soft and squishy, I'll move over to another part, let the neck cool down, and then I can come back to it once a little time has passed working on another area. That also keeps you from getting over focused on any area too. Sometimes if you spend too long on one spot, you kind of miss the big picture of the entire sculpture, so it's good to move around often in general. Especially when we start getting more into the anatomy and things like that. So one of the most common mistakes beginners make is just hyper-focusing on one area. And you're really getting into sculpting this leg, and you're like, oh, this leg looks good, you got it to a good spot, and then you go over to another area and realize, oh, I actually sculpted that leg too big. So then you have to go back and undo all the work you had done on that leg. So definitely moving around the sculpture is a good habit to get into. In this initial, blockout phase, getting clay onto the armature is the main objective. Getting the overall proportions accurate. We don't want to bother detailing anything until all of the major shapes are in place and looking accurate. And we're not necessarily sculpting the anatomy at this point, but you are laying shapes in while keeping anatomy in mind. So laying the pieces of clay down in the shape of the muscle or the part of the body that you're working on. There may be areas that you want to remain as epoxy sculpt. I don't know if I'm going to do that with this particular sculpture, but say like the tail, you want that to be extra strong for whatever reason. Maybe it's really thinner than this one. You can just leave that bare. Even if it's messy like this, you can always go back later and add another layer of epoxy sculpt over top to finish that off. After you've got a baked finished sculpture, you can go back and reinforce areas or do some final detailing work over top of your baked Sculpey piece. And as I've mentioned, make sure you're always turning your sculpture and making sure everything looks accurate from multiple angles. So work on getting through this initial phase relatively quickly without putting too much thought into it. You really want to get a base going so we can go back and refine and detail. You just don't want to get hyper-focused on this stage, making everything look perfect, when in reality you're going to be going back and changing or adding to quite a bit of it. So get away from thinking about making it perfect from the get-go and just really focus on covering the armature with clay and just getting the overall shapes and pose to come through. So about 15 minutes in here, and I already got quite a bit of this covered. I generally try to get this initial phase done in under an hour. Starting out, it's going to take you more time. With each sculpture you do, try to get a little faster at this beginning stage. It's like creating a loose initial sketch on paper. The quicker you go, the less you're using the left side of your brain, and just kind of getting the overall feel and flow. And then going back and worrying about all the details and getting everything perfect. So this is a point that you really want to have anatomy references out and as much photo reference as possible. I currently just have this sketch in front of me, but again, this is a character that I'm used to sculpting. I probably will at some point later on have some references off to the side to work off of. Can never have too much reference. And as far as work surfaces go for Sculpey/Polymer, it's not as damaging as epoxy sculpt is, but it will definitely get stuck in carpet, and it can damage surfaces if it's sitting on it too long. So working on glass or just like a dedicated work surface. So remember, it's got those the plasticizers in it that will leak out. Porous surface like wood will pull those plasticizers out. Makes it kind of like an oil stain. Definitely way too skinny in the hips right now. Add some mass there. Sometimes you gotta do a lot of pinching to get the Sculpey to really adhere to the epoxy sculpt underneath. Just work to get it as tight as you can. You don't want to feel the clay shifting around, because that will cause problems later. It'll make it harder to detail, and it could lead to cracking when you eventually bake it. So take the time to make sure everything is nice and smooth and not shifting around. It's definitely an issue you want to address early on, because once you've got detail on there, you don't want to be mushing around the clay and smashing up all your nice detail work. In general, you always want to be thinking about the next step in your sculpting process. It's kind of like paving the way for the next step. Make things easier for yourself. And that is definitely something that will become easier with experience, the more sculptures that you do, because you'll start noticing where you make errors or where things could have been made easier through some initial steps. So the next time you sculpt, you'll be like, hey, I remember this. I should have taken care of this to begin with. Okay, so I've got most of the body blocked in here, and for the head I'm just going to get a very simple shape going on there. So just really I got like a ball on there for the main shape of the head, and then just kind of smooth in a wedge shape for the snout. And I'm going to use my rubber tool. I like to use the metal part of the rubber tool to help me smooth clay together, especially when I'm adding on like a separate piece like that. Helps blend it in a bit. Okay, so that is a basic blocked-in sculpture there. I mean, got the idea of the pose. Tell it's a fox or a dog of some sort, canine, vulpine. Still very far to go, of course, but as you can see, in under an hour, I got a pretty good start to this figure here. So the next step is going to be refining the forms and defining the anatomy, and getting kind of the secondary shapes going, especially in the face. So that is going to be for the next section.